There are some people in this world who are just built differently, not in the way we casually say that about athletes or entrepreneurs. No, truly, deeply, almost frighteningly different. The kind of different that makes you stop whatever you are doing, sit still, and wonder how something like that is even possible. David was one of those people. He was born in Melbourne, Australia, in 1947, into a family that did not have much. No grand piano in the living room. No music teacher lined up before he could walk. Just a small, crowded house, a strict father, and a boy who somehow, from the very beginning, was drawn to music like a moth to a flame. His father, Peter, was a man who had survived things most people cannot even imagine. He had lived through one of the darkest periods in human history, lost almost everything, and carried that weight quietly inside him every single day. That kind of pain either breaks a person completely or turns them into something very hard, very determined, and very hard to say no to. Peter was the second kind. When Peter noticed that little David had a natural feel for music, he did not just encourage it, he became obsessed with it. He would find a second-hand piano and place it in the house. David would sit at it for hours, not because anyone forced him to, but because to him, sitting at that piano felt like the most natural thing in the world, like breathing, like coming home. He was barely old enough to read properly, and yet his small fingers moved across those keys with a kind of ease that made adults stop and stare. His teachers noticed it first. They would be explaining something basic, a scale, a simple chord, and David would not just repeat it. He would absorb it, feel it, and then do something with it that no one had asked him to do. He would add something, a little twist, a little emotion, something that did not belong to a child his age. That is the thing about rare talent. It does not wait for permission. As David grew older, so did his ability. He started entering local competitions and winning them, then regional competitions and winning those too. People in Melbourne began talking about him. Parents would whisper about him to other parents. Music teachers would bring their own students just to watch him play, as if watching him might teach their students something that words never could. There was something almost unsettling about it, not in a bad way, but in the way that beautiful things can sometimes feel too big for the space they are placed in. David playing a small community hall felt like watching a river trying to fit through a garden hose. The talent was simply too large for the ordinary world around it. And yet, despite all the attention, David himself was not what you might expect. He was not cold or serious the way some prodigies are. He did not carry himself like someone who knew he was special. He was warm, gentle, almost childlike in the way he moved through the world. He laughed easily. He talked fast, jumping from one thought to another. When he was not at the piano, he was ordinary in the most lovely way possible. But the moment he sat down and placed his hands on those keys, everything changed. It was as if a switch was flipped somewhere deep inside him, and the person who had just been laughing and chattering disappeared, and something older and wiser took over. People who watched him as a young boy would later say they knew, even then, that they were watching someone who would either reach the very top or burn trying. His father pushed hard, very hard. The practice sessions were long. The standards were high. There was very little room for error, very little patience for laziness, and very little space for David to just be a regular boy doing regular boy things. Peter had decided that his son's gift was not something to be treated lightly. In his mind, to waste it would be a kind of sin. So the hours at the piano kept growing, and David kept growing with them. Some people who knew the family back then felt uncomfortable watching it. A child that young, they thought, should be outside playing, should be making mistakes and laughing about them, should have room to breathe. But David never seemed to resent it, not visibly, not then. He loved the piano too much. Even on the days when the practice was hard and his fingers were tired, the music itself was always the reward. By the time he was a teenager, David was not just locally known anymore. His name had begun to travel. Music circles talked about him. Opportunities started appearing. And with those opportunities came a reputation that began building around him, slowly at first, and then all at once. He was not just a talented kid from Melbourne anymore. He was becoming something else entirely. Teachers who had spent their entire careers training musicians said they had never seen anything quite like him. One of his instructors reportedly told colleagues that teaching David felt less like instructing and more like simply watching someone remember something they already knew, as if the music was already inside him, and all the lessons were just helping him find the door. That kind of praise does something to a person's reputation. It stacks up, layer by layer, until it becomes a structure so tall and solid that people stop questioning it. They stop asking whether it is true and simply accept it. They begin to repeat it. And when enough people repeat something with enough confidence, it stops being an opinion and starts being a fact. David was the best. That was the fact. The ultimate pianist, the one who was going to change everything. The boy from a simple house in Melbourne who had somehow arrived in the world carrying a gift that most musicians spend their entire lives chasing and never catch. It was a beautiful story, inspiring, the kind that makes you believe in something bigger than everyday life. But beautiful stories have a way of putting an enormous amount of pressure on the person living inside them. And pressure, quiet, invisible, building slowly over years, does not announce itself before it breaks something. It just breaks it. There comes a point in every remarkable life where the dream and the cost of chasing it start to look exactly the same. David had reached that point. He just did not know it yet. By the time the opportunity came to study at one of the most respected music institutions in the world, the Royal College of Music in London, David was no longer just a local story. He was a young man carrying a reputation that had outgrown the city he was born in. The offer to study in London was not just an opportunity. It was confirmation. It was the world saying, yes, you are exactly who everyone says you are. But getting there was not simple. His father did not want him to go. That might sound strange at first. A father who had pushed his son so hard, who had built his entire belief system around this boy's gift, and yet, when the biggest door of all swung open, he wanted it shut. The reasons were complicated, layered with fear and love and control, all twisted together in a way that is difficult to separate neatly. Peter had always believed that family stayed together, that the world outside was dangerous, that he alone understood what was best for David. Letting him go to London meant letting go of something, and Peter was not a man built for letting go. David went anyway. That decision, quiet, determined, painful, was perhaps the first truly independent thing David had ever done in his life. And it cost him deeply on the inside, even as it opened everything on the outside. London was a different world entirely. He arrived carrying his talent, like a suitcase he had packed so many times he could do it in his sleep. But everything else, the culture, the distance from home, the absence of his family, the sudden silence where his father's voice used to be, was completely new. For a young man who had grown up in a tightly controlled environment, the freedom was almost disorienting. There was no one telling him when to practice, when to sleep, when to eat. There was just him, and the piano, and the enormous weight of everyone's expectations sitting quietly in the corner of every room he walked into. He threw himself into the work. And the work was brutal. The Royal College of Music was not a place for people who were simply talented. Everyone there was talented. The students around David had been training their whole lives too. They were disciplined, technically sharp, and deeply serious. For the first time, David was not the most remarkable person in the room. He was one of many remarkable people, all competing for the same limited air. That shift does something to a person. It either hardens them or quietly begins to wear them down. For David, it did something in between. He pushed harder. He practiced longer. He refused to let himself be average in a room full of excellence. And the more pressure he felt, the deeper he went into the music, as if the piano was both the source of the pressure and the only place he could escape from it. Then came the decision that would define everything. For his final recital, the performance that would mark the end of his studies and stand as a statement of everything he was capable of, David chose to play Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. If you are not familiar with classical music, let me explain what that means. Rachmaninoff's Third is widely considered the most technically and emotionally demanding piano concerto ever written. Professional pianists, people who have spent decades mastering the instrument, describe it as a mountain that never fully lets you reach the top. It requires not just extraordinary technique, but an almost terrifying level of emotional endurance. You cannot play it halfway. You cannot hold anything back. It demands everything, and then asks for a little more on top of that. Most students would never dare choose it. The risk was simply too great. David chose it without hesitation. Some people who heard about his decision thought he was being reckless. Others thought it was the most David thing he could possibly do, because he had never been someone who played it safe. The music had always called him toward the hardest, most consuming places. That was where he felt most alive. The day of the performance arrived. The room was full. The air was thick with the kind of silence that only happens when a large group of people are collectively holding their breath. David walked out, sat down, and for a moment just looked at the keys the way someone might look at an old friend they have not seen in a long time. Then he began to play. What happened in that room over the next 45 minutes or so is something that people who were present have tried to describe many times over the years, and none of them have ever quite managed to do it justice. They use words like extraordinary, devastating, alive. One person said it felt less like watching a performance and more like watching someone pour every single thing they had ever felt directly into the air. He played like a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to give. When the final note ended and the sound slowly dissolved into the walls of that room, there was a moment of complete stillness. And then the applause came, the kind that does not start politely and build gradually, but erupts all at once, because the people clapping cannot help themselves. It was, by every account, the performance of his life. And backstage, the moment it was over, the moment the door closed behind him, and the applause faded, and the silence returned, something inside David Helfgott gave way. Not dramatically, not with any warning, just quietly, like a wall that has been holding back water for too long, and finally, on an ordinary Tuesday, decides it cannot hold any more. The breakdown that followed was not a small thing. It was total, complete, the kind that does not pass in a few days or a few weeks. Doctors were called, diagnoses were made, and the young man who had just delivered what many considered one of the finest piano performances anyone in that room had ever witnessed simply disappeared from the world. The crown had been too heavy all along. Nobody had just thought to mention it. Some people fall from great heights, and the world watches. Other people fall quietly, behind closed doors, and the world only finds out later, when the story has already ended or changed into something no one expected. David's fall was the second kind. After the breakdown, there were no dramatic headlines, no public announcements. The world of classical music simply noticed, after a while, that the name everyone had been talking about had gone quiet. And in a world that moves fast and forgets faster, quiet is its own kind of disappearance. For the years that followed, David lived in a way that most people on the outside would have found deeply difficult to understand. He spent time in psychiatric institutions. He went through treatments. He carried a diagnosis that, in those decades, was not spoken about openly the way mental health is discussed today. There was a heaviness to his days that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with simply trying to stay functional, stay present, stay alive in the most basic sense of the word. The piano, for a long time, was out of reach. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally. The very thing that had defined him, saved him, and ultimately broken him was complicated now. Like a relationship that has gone through something painful. You still love the person, but being around them reminds you of things you are not ready to feel again. Years passed, slowly, the way years do when life is contracted into small, careful routines. And then something shifted. It did not happen all at once. It never does. It started with small moments. David sitting near a piano at a care facility, letting his fingers touch the keys lightly. Then a little more. Then longer. The music came back to him in pieces the way memories return after a long illness. Not in full sentences, but in fragments, in flashes, in unexpected moments that catch you off guard and fill your chest with something you forgot was there. The people around him noticed. Those who were caring for him, those who had not given up on him during the hard years, could see that when David played, even imperfectly, even for just a few minutes, something in him settled. The restlessness that lived in him quieted down. His eyes, which could sometimes seem far away, came back into focus. Music was still his language. It had always been his language. The illness had taken many things from him, but it had not taken that. Eventually, David found his way to a small wine bar in Perth, Australia. He had returned home, years after leaving for London, as a young man full of promise. And in this small, ordinary venue, nothing like the grand concert halls of his past, he began playing again regularly. Not for critics. Not for reputations. Just for people who came in for a quiet evening and ended up staying longer than they planned, because the man at the piano was doing something to the air in the room. Word spread, gently at first, the way small, beautiful things tend to. People would bring friends. Friends would bring others. There was no marketing, no campaign, no carefully managed public image. Just David, the piano, and that rare and honest kind of music that only comes from someone who has been through real things and survived them. It was during this quieter chapter of his life that he met the woman who would become his wife, Gillian. She was warm, grounded, and she saw David not as the legendary prodigy or the broken patient, but simply as the person he was. Their relationship became one of the most stabilizing forces in his life. She stood beside him with a steadiness that he had rarely experienced. And that steadiness mattered more than most people realized. Then, in 1996, everything changed again. A film came out called Shine. It told David's story, the gifted boy, the controlling father, the breakdown, the long road back. It was raw, emotional, and deeply human. The actor who played David delivered a performance so powerful that it won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film was nominated for multiple Oscars. It was seen by millions of people around the world. And overnight, David Helfgott was no longer a forgotten name from the past. He was a phenomenon. The letters came. The interview requests came. The concert promoters came. The world, which had moved on without him for decades, suddenly remembered who he was and decided it wanted more. A world concert tour was organized. Major venues were booked. Audiences in cities across Europe, America, and beyond bought tickets in enormous numbers. They had watched the film. They had cried at his story. And now they wanted to see the real man, sitting at a real piano, doing the real thing. It was one of the most remarkable second acts anyone could have imagined. And David stepped into it with the same openness he had always carried, that warm, unguarded, almost childlike willingness to just show up and play. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody quite prepared for. The critics came too. And the critics were not there to celebrate a human story. They were there to evaluate a pianist. They had read the reputation. They had heard the legend. They arrived at those concert halls carrying the standard that David's name had always been attached to. The ultimate pianist, the untouchable talent, the once-in-a-generation gift. What they found was something more complicated than that. David played, and there were moments, genuine, breathtaking moments, where the old brilliance surfaced like light breaking through clouds. passages of such beauty that people sat with their hands pressed to their mouths and tears running down their faces. Those moments were real, completely real. But there were other moments too. Stumbles, uneven tempos, notes that wandered slightly off course. The kind of imperfections that a healthy, fully trained concert pianist at the peak of their career would not make. The reviews that followed were not kind. Some were not just unkind, they were brutal. Critics wrote about the gap between the legend and the reality, between what the reputation had promised and what the performances had delivered, between the myth of the ultimate pianist and the very human, very fragile man actually sitting on that stage. The reputation that had taken a lifetime to build cracked in full public view within a matter of weeks, and the world had a front row seat. When the noise dies down, what is left is usually the truth. Not the version of the truth that gets printed in newspapers or debated in review columns. Not the truth that fits neatly into a headline or a 2-minute conversation at a dinner party. The quieter truth, the one that does not perform for anyone. The one that simply exists, whether or not the world is paying attention. After the concert tour ended, and the critical reviews had done what critical reviews do, stung, circulated, and then faded, the world moved on. That is what the world does. It finds the next story, the next name, the next moment to be fascinated by. And the person who is briefly the center of all that attention is left standing in the sudden quiet, figuring out what comes next. For many people, that kind of public disappointment would have been the end, not just of a career, but of the will to continue at all. To have your name rebuilt so publicly, to have people arrive with such enormous hope, and then to watch that hope curdle into criticism in real time, that is a particular kind of painful that most of us will never have to experience. It sits in a category all its own. But David kept playing, not because he was trying to prove something, not because he was chasing the reputation back, not because some manager or publicist told him it was the smart move. He kept playing because the music was still there, still alive inside him, still the one language in which everything made sense. The reviews could say what they wanted. The critics could compare him to the legend and find him lacking. None of that changed what happened to David when he sat down at a piano and let his hands find their way. And that quiet, stubborn, deeply personal relationship with music was something no review could ever touch. The people who came to see him in the years after the tour were different from the ones who had arrived expecting a legend. They were not there to measure him against a reputation. They were there because they had heard something about him, maybe from a friend, maybe from a small article, maybe just from the feeling they got when someone described what it was like to watch him play. They arrived with open hands instead of checklists. And what they received in return was something they had not entirely expected. They received honesty, not the polished, controlled honesty of a performer who has rehearsed every emotion. Real honesty, the kind that only comes from someone who has already lost everything that was not real and is therefore no longer afraid of being seen. David played with his whole self, the brilliant parts and the imperfect parts, the soaring passages and the stumbles, the moments of such extraordinary beauty that the room held its breath, and the moments that reminded you he was just a man, not a myth. And people loved him for it, not in the frenzied, manufactured way that fame produces love, that loud, temporary kind that disappears the moment the cameras turn away, but in a slower, more durable way, the way you love something that is genuinely true. Audiences would leave his performances and stand outside in the night air and try to explain to each other what they had just felt, and most of them could not quite find the words. It was not the feeling of having witnessed perfection. It was something more like the feeling of having witnessed a person, fully, completely, without any of the usual walls up. That is a rare thing to experience in any performance, in any art form, and it became, quietly, David's greatest gift. There is something worth sitting with in that idea, that the very things which broke his public, Reputation turned out to be the things that made him most meaningful to the people who truly connected with him. The illness that had taken so much also stripped away every artificial layer, every performance of invincibility, every pretense of being above ordinary human struggle. What was left underneath was not damaged goods. It was something more valuable than the untouchable prodigy had ever been. It was a real person. His wife remained by his side through all of it, the tour, the criticism, the long ordinary days that followed. There is a particular kind of strength in that kind of steadiness, in choosing someone not for what the world says about them, but for who they actually are when the lights are off and the applause has long since stopped. She understood David in a way that the music world, for all its admiration, never quite managed to. She saw the whole picture, and she stayed. David continued performing well into the later decades of his life. The venues were not always grand. The audiences were not always enormous. But the music was always present, always alive, always carrying that unmistakable quality that had first made people stop and stare when he was just a small boy in Melbourne pressing his fingers to second-hand keys. He never stopped being extraordinary at the thing that mattered most, which was not perfection, but presence. The ability to be completely, fully there. To make every person in the room feel as though the music was speaking directly to them, personally, about something they had never quite been able to say out loud themselves. That is not something you can manufacture. You cannot practice it into existence or critique it into someone. It either lives in a person or it does not. In David, it lived deeply, and no amount of hardship had managed to take it out. The story of his life is not really a story about a reputation being built and broken, even though that is part of it. It is a story about what survives when everything constructed around a person falls away. What remains when the labels are gone, when the comparisons stop, when the world has moved on to something new, and the only audience left is the one that genuinely came to listen. What remained, in David's case, was everything that had mattered from the beginning. A boy who loved music. A man who never stopped. And something in the space between those two facts that is very difficult to put into words, but impossible to forget once you have felt it. Some reputations are built to impress. Some lives are built to endure. His was always the second kind. It just took the world a little while to understand the difference.